The Russian Empire was one of the largest nations in history, but in this video I want to explore how we can alter Russian history between 1815 and 1914, seeing how we can build an even larger Russia from this time period. As always in this series, I will be focusing this video on the geopolitical ambitions of Russia and not worry too much about the internal development or politics of the nation. With that said, let's dive in. In the early decades following the Congress of Vienna, there isn't too much to change. Europe is recovering from the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, and while Russia is dealing with some minor conflicts in the Caucasus and Central Asia, there's really not too much we can alter. The first major change we can make though is during the Egyptian-Ottoman Wars. Egypt was led by Muhammad Ali, who managed to trounce the Ottomans in a war, gaining control over the Levant. The second war, however, would see the Ottomans gain support from most of the European great powers, forcing the Egyptians to return everything east of the Sinai to the Ottomans. But before we dive into some alternate conflicts, why not explore some for yourselves in the excellent game World of Warships? As a completely free-to-play game that's available on PC, it's the perfect game for any history fan. Every single month, more content is being added with new ships, nations, looks. The game will constantly feel fresh during amazing 12v12 battles. World of Warship has over 40 maps with dynamic weather and beautiful water effects and textures, almost making it feel like you're really there. You can play the game any way you want. Experience the powerful battleships, agile destroyers, the stealthy submarines, or even an aircraft carrier if the air is more of your speed. The game is not just available on PC either, as it's available on most major consoles. So be sure to go down to the link in the description to download the game, entering the code WARSHIPS to receive exclusive in-game rewards like a bunch of doubloons and credits, a free ship and premium account time. So what are you waiting for? Go to the link in the description and start playing now. Here I want to propose a change. In our timeline, France and Spain supported Egypt, while most of the other powers supported the Ottomans, allowing the great powers to overwhelm and strong-arm Egypt. If even just Russia supported Egypt instead, the threat of a war could likely result in a more compromised deal. Perhaps one where Egypt only loses Syria to reduce the threat of the Egyptians marching through Anatolia to Constantinople, ensuring a weaker Ottomans into the future. With this, we can jump to another alternate conflict, an alternate Crimean War. We now have a weaker Ottoman Empire, but that's not enough if the West does decide to stand up to the Russians. What we need for Russia to win this conflict is for the Austrians to support them. This is a little bit of a tall order, as the Austrians, like any other European power, feared the expansion of Russia into the Balkan. But the Austrians did owe the Russians, since it had been Russian forces which broke the Hungarian rebellion a couple years ago. If Russia had been very open in discussing their plans with the Austrians beforehand, promising Austria-Bosnia the neutrality of the Romanian principalities, while only aiming for minor expansion themselves, the Austrians may just be convinced to support the Russians. This would lead to a radically different Crimean War, as if France and Britain do decide to militarily back the Ottomans, everyone could well see that the resulting war could be long and devastating. Under these conditions, a compromise ending could be very well possible, where Russia, Romania and Austria all gain some territory, and the Romanians are officially liberated from Ottoman rule. Which leads us to the matter of Alaska. By all accounts, Russia holding on to Alaska would not be worth it, despite the significant gold and oil reserves of the region. Still, holding on to the territory does give Russia a unique position to have a presence in North America, something only the US and Britain can replicate. Perhaps in this alternate timeline, instead of selling the territory to the US out of fear and economic motives, Russia could keep a hold of it while teaming up with the US to allow American civilians and companies to operate in the territory, tying the US and Russia closer together while making the US invested in keeping the British away from Alaska. Back to Europe, the German Wars of Unification are next, where Russia could have, if they had so chosen, been a major influence by backing the Austrians. But this is also where Russia needs to ask itself an important question. Supporting the Austrians nearly guarantees that the Prussians will lose, if the Prussians even dare to start such a conflict. But was supporting Austria and preventing or slowing the rise of Prussia something that Russia even wanted to do? In terms of cold, hard geopolitics, The Austrians too wanted to dominate the Balkans, and allowing the Prussians to do their thing may be very beneficial to Russia. If the Russians had played their cards right in negotiations with Bismarck, by merely threatening to intervene on the Austrian side, Russia could extract some concessions from the Prussians. When the time comes for the Austro-Prussian War, the Russians managed to extract some economic concessions, and perhaps the secession of some minor territories like Memel or land in Poland. A small price to pay for the unification of the German Empire. With this, the Russians grow slightly larger, while the Austrians are crippled, much like in our timeline. But tick-tock, it's beating up on the Ottomans o'clock. With the steady decline of the Ottomans, holding on to the Balkans has become impossible, as revolts become a more common occurrence. The Ottomans were brutal in keeping these revolts down, and even France and Britain were realizing that keeping the Ottomans as an artificial balancing force in Eastern Europe was an increasingly unrealistic task. The severe and cruel reaction to the revolts did little to endear the Ottomans to the rest of the great powers, and the time was ready to change the borders of the Balkan a bit. In another Russo-Turkic war, the Russians were going in to liberate the Balkan. Militarily speaking, they would have been able to capture most of the Balkan, including Constantinople, but this would have sparked war with the other great powers. Much like in our timeline, Russian gains would be relatively minor. But the real prize is the full independence of the Balkan states, most notably Bulgaria. And in regards to Bulgaria, I want to make a couple of major changes. In our timeline, Russian-Bulgarian relations declined post-Bulgarian independence as Russia focused on Serbia as their vessel for pan-South Slavic ambitions, while the Russians and Bulgarians both have ambitions on the Bosphorus. Relations further strained when Bulgaria sought unification with the autonomous region of Eastern Rumelia, which was still under Ottoman control. Russia, not willing to upset the other great powers, didn't support this unification, even retreating Russian military officers from Bulgaria. Something which became very painful when Serbia invaded Bulgaria, a war in which, again, the Russians did nothing to even diplomatically support the Bulgarians. In this alternate timeline, I want the Russians to at least somewhat support the Bulgarians in their unification, with calls for support becoming louder when it became clear that the other great powers weren't going to stop it. From here, Russia would need to take on the, admittedly, difficult role of overseeing the relations between Bulgaria and Serbia, ensuring that the two South Slavic states become allies rather than rivals in the Balkan. But we have been focused on Europe. What's happening elsewhere? The scramble for Africa could have seen some Russian colonies if we really wanted to, but there's really no point for Russia to get involved. Let's say Russia does secure some colonies, they simply don't have any good naval routes to these colonies, and they simply would not have been worth the effort. Over in Central Asia, Russia has managed to conquer pretty much everything they could, only stopping at Iran and Afghanistan. With the Russo-British rivalry, as well as other great power fears towards the Russians, something like this was pretty much the best that Russia could hope for. We could adjust the borders slightly, but the conquest of Afghanistan or Iran would be extremely difficult by itself, even if Britain wasn't watching carefully to ensure the safety of British India. Meanwhile, the decline of China had seen Russia force concessions in Manchuria, annexing the outer regions while gaining a sphere over the inner regions, as well as a lease over Port Arthur. In Korea, then, Russia hadn't necessarily created a puppet regime, but Korea was clearly in the Russian sphere of influence. But everything changed when Japan attacked. An invasion of Korea put the peninsula under Japanese control as the Japanese continued on into Manchuria. As a result of this Russo-Japanese war, Russia would lose southern Sakhalin, Port Arthur, their influence over Korea, and even their influence over inner Manchuria, while the defeat rocked the Russian political stability to its core. But it didn't have to be this way. This was an all-or-nothing gamble by Japan, and by the end of the war, it was a matter of who would blink first. The Russians were rushing reinforcements east, but thanks to an untimely revolution, these reinforcements would never arrive. Russia had blinked first. But Japan wasn't in a perfect situation either. The Japanese had racked up immense amounts of debt to pay for this conflict. Russia wasn't doing perfectly economically either, but the Japanese were simply running out of cash. Should the Russians have performed better at the start of the war, while Nicholas II responds better to the revolutionaries, perhaps with concessions to them, I don't consider it an impossibility that the Russians could have won this war with better preparation, allowing Russia to keep their position in East Asia intact. Back to Europe, there is a final war regarding the Ottomans. Russia wouldn't get involved, but they'd still be very interested in the outcome, as the Balkan states worked together to tear down the Ottoman Empire. In our timeline, the Balkan powers won a quick victory, but they soon got to fighting over who got to keep what of the spoils. With Russia arbitrating Serbian-Bulgarian relations, we could have peace win out, resulting in a more powerful Bulgaria, while Serbia gets vague promises of future support from Bulgaria and Russia against the Austrians, creating a powerful Russian-aligned bloc in the Balkan. Now, you may be wondering, we've covered a century of history, and Russia isn't really that much larger than in our timeline. This is by design. Some of you may have asked, why doesn't Russia just annex Constantinople, or why doesn't Russia manage to conquer Iran to get warm water Indian Ocean ports? Well, it's simple. We need this alternate Russia to be less of a threat to Europe than Germany is. Or, Russia may very well find themselves at the losing end of a British-German alliance, if not a even larger anti-Russian coalition. Fact is, for the entire time duration of this video, Russia is perceived as a terrifying force for the rest of Europe. By 1914, Russia had more people than the European parts of the German, French and British empires combined. The changes that we have made in this alternate 19th century have made Russia slightly larger, but not some insane threat that the other European powers had to combine to stop. This means that when the German-Austrian and Franco-Russian partnerships develop, Britain can still be more concerned about Germany to such an extent that they join up with the Franco-Russians. With this, the rest of the video was simply a build-up to this final phase, an alternate Great War. By no means does it have to start with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but somewhere, somehow, the Great War still erupts. Initially just between the great powers, but soon joined by minor nations across Europe. Here, a major change we have created is in allowing the Bulgarians to remain in league with the Russians, ensuring that they join the Entente. This allows Bulgaria, Russia and Britain to put major pressure on the Ottomans. I have little hope that the Ottomans can stand up to this barrage long term, as they become the first Central Power member to collapse. Meanwhile, the Serbian front is also changed, as with Bulgaria now on the other side, the Germans and Austrians would have a much harder time pushing through, and even if they do, the mountains of Macedonia might prevent a full Central Powers occupation of the Balkan. All of this, especially the collapse of the Ottomans and the capture of Constantinople, leads to a much more enthusiastic Entente population, which is very important for the Russians, who were facing defeats on their home front still. With the fall of the Ottomans, this war would essentially just be the two Germanic brother nations against most of the world. If Nicholas II is more competent and the Western powers use the opening of the Bosphorus to assist the Russian militarily, but especially their population, I don't consider it an impossibility that Russia manages to hold out, since it's clear to everyone that the Germans will lose this conflict eventually. Especially if the desperate Germans do something stupid to get the Americans involved, which would really put a nail in any hope for victory, the Germans, sooner or later, would see themselves and their alliance collapse. With this, the spoils of war need to be divided. Let's start with the Austrian Empire, which gets divided in a roughly similar way to our timeline, with one crucial difference: Galicia. Galicia consists of two regions, Western Galicia, primarily inhabited by Poles, and Eastern Galicia, primarily inhabited by Ukrainians. Now the big issue is, neither of these nationalities have a nation to join. So I propose that we revive the idea of Polish autonomy within the Russian Empire. Poland remains part of Russia in military and foreign affairs, but they regain many rights of self-governance. This allows Russia to expand farther without upsetting the other great powers too much. Besides, with Russia's proven importance and resilience in the war, the Allies couldn't refuse their expansion. Another potential region that Russia may claim is Carpathia-Ruthenia, a region primarily populated with Ukrainians too. Moving on to the Ottomans, Russia wanted, and was promised, control over Constantinople. But in reality, this was not really something the West was very enthusiastic about. Perhaps a compromise could see the region fall under Bulgarian control instead, still giving Russia more influence, but not full control. In the east, Russia seizes areas of Armenia too, and with Russia involved, I have no hope for Turkey to win their war of independence, as they get carved up by their opponents. Finally, we take a look at Germany, which loses much lands to the Russians and Poles, though, with Poland part of Russia's empire, it is less important for Danzig to be ceded to Poland, resulting in a still unified European German territory, though it now looks terrible. Finishing with the western change of territory, I will conclude the scenario here. Russia is the great Eastern European behemoth, the champion of Pan-Slavism. Still, not all is well. Russia is still underdeveloped compared to Western Europe, and the future of this world is now uncertain, as the Russian Empire, with their ever-growing population, has to come to terms with a changing world order. But that's where I'll end this video. Thank you all for watching, consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content, subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen now. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.